Hello class, today we have another presentation by Professor Choi. Today we're going to have a conversation about what is comparative advantage and what are the gains from trade. Alright, now before we move on to any of that, let's talk a little bit about what exactly is a tariff, a quota, and what are imports and exports. So, and this is just vocabulary to get started. So basically, if this is your country, let's call it the United States, then anything that comes into the country, any good that comes into the country, we call that an import. And again, it doesn't matter whether it comes in whole or in part. Anything that comes in, even if it's a part or a whole good, it's considered an import. Anything that goes out to another country, again, these have to be physical goods, are what we call exports. Okay, so things that come in are called imports, things that go out are called exports, and that's really the definition of what an import and export is. For example, the majority, actually, I think 100% of iPhones are made in China. So all iPhones are imports, at least last time I checked. Okay, so all iPhones are imports. Exports, an example of an export is Caterpillar. So Caterpillar sells a lot of major equipment for manufacturers, miners, things of that sort, and they export a lot of that mining equipment, and those are exports. All right, now what exactly is a quota or a tariff? Usually quotas and tariffs are on the import side, and it's a sort of block on the flow. Again, I say usually because sometimes they're on the export side as well, but most of the time they're on the import side. So a tariff is like a tax, and it's a tax on an import. So it's a tax on something that comes into the country. A quota is a restriction on the amount. So this is, you're only allowed to bring in a certain amount, and that is called a quota. All right, anything after that amount, you gotta send back if you have a quota. All right, restrictions on exports, by the way, are usually not something that happens, but in April of 2020, for example, during the middle of the corona crisis, President Trump made it illegal for personal protective equipment to be exported out of the US for at least a little while. And that is a restriction, that's a quota, again, you could say a quota of 0 on exports. So most tariffs and quotas are usually on imports. Exports usually don't have lots of restrictions. Now, who pays for a tariff is usually a question that I get in my class or I get to this. So the answer, by the way, is a US company or you. And let's kind of understand this a little bit so you understand how it works. So let's say that this is the border, and let's say that you're a company in the US, you decide that you're going to import something into the US. Let's say, I don't know, a phone that you bought on Alibaba, and they sold it to you from a foreign manufacturer. Now let's say you bought the phone for $100. Now let's say that there's an import tariff of 25% on that phone. The way the import tariff works is you now have to pay the government $25, which is 25% of 100, as a tax for bringing this good in. So this phone that you bought becomes a $125 phone, and that is the cost to you. Now this $25 you got to send to the federal government because you imported this good. So it's a tax on the importation of the good, and that's what a tariff is. A tariff is like a tax. All right, now the problem here is that now this becomes a good that you have to sell for more than before. So now it becomes a $125 phone. So as a consequence of an increasing cost, you have to now increase your price when you sell it. And again, just to put an example, if you used to sell this phone for $150 because you wanted to make $50 on the phone, then now you got to add an extra $25 to the phone because it's an extra cost of production. So it now becomes a $175 phone. And that's how you pass down the cost to the consumer. And the consumer is really the one that ultimately pays for a tariff. All right, yes, the foreign country is going to be hurt. And the reason they're going to be hurt is because when prices go up, people buy less. That's what the law of demand basically says. So when prices increase, quantity demanded decreases. So if this happened to be the demand line for this particular product, then we're going to move along the demand line, and at a higher price, we buy less of it. So the foreign country, let's say China, is going to be hurt because there's going to be a decline in the flow of phones to the US. But in terms of actually paying for the phone, the one who pays the tariff is ultimately the consumer or the US company that imported the product. All right, now how big is the US in the import-export market? Well, the US is one of the largest exporters in the world. It's also one of the largest importers in the world. And then what you normally get on the news is they talk about the US trade deficit. Now let me show you how big is the US. And we're just going to pull information here from internet sources. I like to go to the CIA World Factbook, by the way. Okay, so I used to tell my students all the time that I used to carry the CIA World Factbook on a book, and I actually used to have this book as a physical book before the internet was available in all classes. So let's take a look at the amount of exports the US produces. All right, so exports. Oh, I clicked on the definition of exports. Okay, so this is the amount of exports in the US in the year 2017. That was $1.5 trillion. If you click right here on this number, it will give you the list of countries and the amount of exports. So as of the year 2018-2017, China is the largest exporter in the world, with the US being the second largest exporter in the world, and a very close third, Germany, as the third largest exporter in the world. And again, exports are the things that are from your country going out to the rest of the world. So let's use that number, put it over here. So again, the amount of exports of stuff from the US to other countries is about $1.5 trillion. All right. Let's take a look at the amount of imports. All right, now the amount of imports in the U.S. is $2.3 trillion, and the U.S. is the largest importer in the world. So again, notice this is the level of imports. China is also, by the way, the second largest importer in the world. Germany is the third largest importer in the world. So imports in the U.S. 2.3 trillion. So 2.3 trillion. Now the difference between the amount that you export and the amount that you import is what we call net exports. Some books use NX, other ones use XN, the same. Okay, this is basically exports minus imports, and exports is 1.5 trillion, while imports is 2.3 trillion, and that creates a trade deficit for the U.S. of around $800 billion. Trade deficit, and we use negative for that because it's a drag on gross domestic product. All right, so as the time of this video was made, the U.S. trade deficit was $800 billion or so. If you're interested in learning about the actual trade deficit, notice that these numbers, by the way, are a little outdated. Then the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA.gov, is the agency in charge in the U.S. of collecting that information. So if you click right here, it says Economy at a Glance. They will give you over here the current account. And the current account includes the goods number. Okay, and the negative trade deficit is this deficit on goods that you see here. This portion, again, that says goods. All right, now notice, by the way, that this is in 200, it's also in quarters. So the deficit in the US is about 800 billion because it's 200 per quarter. All right, now what exactly do we export in the US? Well, the largest general things that we export are chemicals, aircraft, semiconductors, automobiles, agricultural products. What are the things that we import? Well, we import a lot of automobiles, we import a lot of petroleum, household appliances, and clothing. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, look at the CIA World Factbook. Something interesting that I always like to talk about when I'm doing this particular chapter, by the way, is for you to check your own car to see if it's an import. Okay, so I want you to all right, usually Wikipedia keeps a pretty good article on this, by the way. So here is a list of cars that are actually manufactured in the United States, in case you're interested in learning about that. And you're going to notice that a lot of these names are not American. That's because in the US, we produce a lot of products that are not by American companies, but they are produced here. Pretty much all Acuras, for example, are produced in the US. Majority of Hondas are produced in the US. Hyundai has major plants in the US as well. Kia has major plants in the US. Nissan has some of the largest manufacturing facilities in the entire world right here in the US. Subaru produces almost everything in the US except for the special edition Impreza, the WRX and the STI. Toyota has a lot of manufacturing facilities in the US. Tesla is, of course, a US manufacturer right now with some facilities in Germany and China. As you can see, Volkswagen also manufactures in the US, and Volvo manufactures in the US. And I forgot BMW and Mercedes-Benz here at the top. on top of the American manufacturers, like Jeep, Dodge, Ford, Lincoln, Cadillac, and Chevy, and GMC. All right. So anyway, if you're interested in knowing whether your car is made in the USA or not, just Google. At the time that you're watching this video, cars made in the USA, and hopefully they have an updated list there. And then you can figure out whether your car is made in the USA. Now, how do you actually benefit from trade? Because a lot of the conversations that we normally have about trade is that about how bad it is and many jobs have been lost. But in reality, we all benefit from trade because it creates competition. Also, it allows you to buy things that you would otherwise not be able to buy because there's certain things that simply cannot be produced in your country. Some countries benefit more than other countries from trade. A really good example is a country like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very rich in oil, and oil right now happens to be a valuable resource. Maybe not in the year 2020 when the price of oil is really low. But in general, oil is a valuable resource because a lot of the things that we consume are derived from oil. Saudi Arabia, though, doesn't have a lot of arable land. They are in the middle of the desert, and very few of their land can be used for the production of food. So Saudi Arabia imports a lot of food. A lot of the times they buy land all over the world, and then they produce stuff in that land, and they just literally export all of it to Saudi Arabia. What do they give to the world? They provide oil for the world. Okay? And that's basically the benefit of international trade. You don't really have everything that you need. Something, for example, that the US lacks as of the year 2020 is something called rare earth minerals, which is a sort of set of minerals that are highly used today for some of the technology that we have. Last time I checked, China is the largest producer of rare earth minerals all over the world. Something like 80% of the production comes from China. That's also why China is one of the largest manufacturers of some of the latest technology, especially consumer gadgets out there, because they also control a large part of the production, a large part of the mining that is required for a lot of those products. So everybody benefits from international trade because it allows both countries to consume more and cheaper, and therefore it increases living standards. There's always, though, a pushback against that because, of course, when you open up trade, you have also more competition, and at some point, companies that are not as efficient as other ones or not as cost effective will go out of business. So how come we don't completely specialize and produce whatever we're really good at and then drop everything else that we're not good at on somebody else? Well, not everything can be traded internationally. A really good example of that is a haircut. So you can't really export or import a haircut, nor can you export or import childcare, for example. So there's a lot of stuff that cannot be traded internationally, so it has to be produced locally. Another thing is the production of the majority of goods involve increasing opportunity costs. The more and more you try to become a producer of something, the more and more difficult it becomes because your supply line becomes more and more strained. You don't have unlimited resources. One of the things that we always talk about in economics is this issue of scarcity, which is very much prevalent constantly. Product tastes are different from country to country, so you can't standardize products and just send them to the rest of the world. Sometimes people just don't like the way you make a particular product. Some countries also like to produce products strategically. One of the failures in the year 2020 with the COVID-19 epidemic in the US is that our medical supply line, our medical supply inventory and production has been exported to other countries, and we are very dependent on other countries for a lot of our medical equipment. So in the COVID-19 epidemic, a lot of these supply problems were exposed when those countries had their own problems and they did not want to export all of that medical equipment to the rest of the world until they had their own field. Okay, so the COVID-19 epidemic in the US has exposed some of the weaknesses of not having the production of some of those things in the US strategically as we should have. All right. What can give you a comparative advantage over other countries? Comparative advantages are basically things that make you more efficient than other countries for multiple reasons. Climate is something that could give you a comparative advantage. Oil, by the way, is a really good example of something like that. If you have a lot of oil under you, then it's just easy to pull it out. If you're a country that has a lot of forests, for example, then you can be a large wood producer. But if you don't have a lot of forests, then you cannot produce wood. If you're a country that has a lot of arable land, then you can produce a lot of food. But if you're a country that doesn't have a lot of arable land, then you cannot be a large food producer. So the relative abundance and location can create different comparative advantages. The other one is the difference between capital and labor. Let's take a look at the population in the world so you understand the population differences and how prevalent they can be. All right, so as of again, April 2020, the US has about 329 million people. In the year 2020, by the way, the US is running a census, and everyone should participate on the census because it is mandated by the Constitution, and it is the way in which we find out how many people are in the US. Everyone should participate in the US census, regardless of whether you are legal or illegal in the US or citizen or non-citizen. Everyone needs to be counted. That information, by the way, will not be available to ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Office. All right, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. All right, in any case, let's go to China. Notice that China has 1,433,000,000 people. Again, let's compare that with the US, 329 million people. So China basically has 4 times more people than the US has. So they have a labor advantage. If you look at India, right next to China, they have 1.3 million people, 1.3 billion people. That's 1,366,000,000 people. Again, India has about 4 times more people than the US has. And if you look at a bunch of countries right around, Pakistan has almost the same population as the US. All right. Notice that there's a lot of population in Asia, in lots and lots of fairly small countries. So there's a lot of places. Look, Indonesia has 270 million people. So there's a lot of places where things can be produced pretty cheaply, especially in Asia. So they have a labor advantage. The US, though, is highly, it's an environment where we produce things using a lot of machines. So we have a capital advantage, at least for now. China, by the way, is catching up very quickly when it comes to lots of these capital advantages. Technological advantages, I would say that today, with the world sharing a lot of technology, the technological advantage of the Western world compared to the Eastern world is sort of going away. But there is still a bit of a technological edge on the Western world in general. Now, let's talk a little about government restrictions. Free trade is when we conduct trade, but we don't restrict it in almost any way. That's what we call in general free trade. Now, free trade usually helps consumers, but it hurts companies because companies may not be as efficient as the foreign competitors that are coming in. And I want you to think about in the flow of stuff. So imagine that this is a US. If you used to live in a sort of blocked market, then the price that you're charging has to do with the competitors around you. But one of the reasons why other people may want to come into your country is because maybe they can produce something cheaper than you. So when they come in, they immediately try to charge a price lower than yours, and welcome to competition. That requires you to figure out how to lower your price to match theirs, which means that you have to reduce costs. Now, sometimes this is possible, but sometimes it is not. As I was mentioning, some of these foreign countries have a labor advantage. In other words, they have lots and lots of people. As a consequence of that, they have much lower wages per person because labor is abundant. So wages are lower. In industrialized nations like the US with less population and a lot of these places, wages are much higher. As a consequence of that, you do not have a labor cost advantage. And that requires sometimes to charge higher prices in countries like the US for a same product that you can produce in a different country at lower prices, simply because of the wage differential. All right. So sometimes the government intervenes in trade with different type of trade intervention strategies. Things like tariffs, which we already talked about, quotas, or excessive licensing requirements. Now, some of the things that worked a little bit better than tariffs and quotas is what we call a voluntary export restraint. The voluntary export restraint is basically an agreement negotiated between two countries bilaterally that places a numeric limit on the quantity that can be imported from that particular country. A voluntary export restraint will basically work as follows. Imagine that the US had pretty good relationships with the country Ocho-Ethiopia. And imagine that the country Ocho-Ethiopia can produce tires much cheaper than the US. So if I were to import all of my tires into the US, I would probably take over the tire market within 10 years. The US can come and talk to me about a voluntary export restraint. A voluntary export restraint is basically a quota that is managed by Ocho-Ethiopia. So they would say something like, look, we don't want to completely not have your product, but you need to bring in less than, so our companies can adjust to your competition as time goes by. So instead of say, allow me to import 1 million, they would say, okay, well, you can bring in 500,000, and then you manage who gets to bring it. So you figured out what company you're going to give that quota to, but that's the amount that you're allowed. And that's what a voluntary export restraint is. It's kind of like creating a quota system, but allowing Ocho-Ethiopia to manage it versus you managing on this side. All right. Now remember, we're still going to have gains from trades when you open up trade because the consumer benefits quite a lot from international trade. Why do we intervene in trade? Well, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this slide because this missing intervention in trade, most economies in general don't like intervention in trade. Like if you talk to, let's say, 10 economists, then 9 of them will say that trade intervention is bad. Then you always have the random person that says trade intervention is okay. So why do we have these differences? Well, the theory is very clear that trade intervention is bad, and the data that we have is very clear that trade intervention is bad. But sometimes trade intervention may be necessary because a lot of countries may be in the process of taking over your industry, and they're doing it as a sort of concerted effort to get rid of your industry. Dumping is an example of that. So let's talk about some of the dumping strategies that countries may use to take over a particular market. So let's say that, again, this is the country Ocho-Ethiopia. And the country Ocho-Ethiopia wants to take over the US tire industry. And US tire industry, by the way, as of the year 2020, is still a pretty strong industry. All right, so how would I take over? Well, first of all, I have to figure out how to make tires myself. So I could go into the US and talk to US manufacturers and say, hey, look, Goodyear, why don't you open a company in Choitopia? And Goodyear would say, well, okay, I'm listening. And Choitopia would say, okay, look, I'm going to sell you the land. And because I'm the government, I'm going to charge you 0% interest on this loan. I mean, I own the bank, so I can just give you a loan at 0%. Because I'm the government, I'm going to sell you the land also very cheaply. Or I'm going to rent it to you for 100 years. So we're going to create a 100-year lease on this land. All right, at a very cheap rate. And you go, okay, I'm listening. And, well, because I also control the manufacturing industry for infrastructure, we're talking about stuff like cement, mining, etc., then I'm going to go and give you beneficial treatment for the purchase of all the things that you need in order to build your factory. In other words, I'm going to sell you all this stuff really nice and cheap. So your factory, building your factory becomes easy to do. And then on top of that, I'm going to create policies to move my population to where your factory is. In other words, I'm going to build housing for these people. I'm going to build infrastructure for these people, restaurants, hotels, etc. And it's all going to be around your factory. So my population is going to want to move to this. And then because your factory is there, they're eventually just going to get a job in your factory. On top of that, I own the electric company. So I can give you pretty good electricity and access to the resources that you need. On top of that, I know you're not going to be selling all this stuff over here, so I'm going to go ahead and build you the port. So you can take all this stuff out, and I'll build all the roads that you need in order to connect your factory to that. And Goodyear at this point is going, okay, where do I sign? All right. Now, this is not just happening with American companies, it's also happening with Chinese companies. Choitopia companies. I'm also benefiting them and giving them more money and making things cheaper. So what happens is when you're looking at the price of a tire in the US and you're looking at the tire manufacturers in the US, they don't have all of these cost advantages. So the price of production of tire in the US is high. But then when something comes from Choitopia, because of all these help that corporations are getting from the government that helps them with their cost structure, then the prices that they can charge in the US are much lower. So when they come into the US, they come with a cost advantage that is sort of artificial. And that's what we call dumping. It's when you take your products and you dump them really nice and cheaply. In this case, again, we're talking about cheap tires. You dump them in the other country, and then as a consequence of that, you can take over the industry fairly quickly. That's what we call dumping. All right. Now, dumping has been used pretty efficiently all over the world by China to take over individual industries in different markets. If a lot of those competitive advantages were not enough, China uses an extra advantage. One of the things that they do is they artificially create an exchange rate that makes their currency cheaper compared to currencies of other countries. As a consequence of that, it makes somebody who goes to China be able to buy things cheaper over there because you become wealthier basically as the currency of that country is depreciated. To understand again this thing about appreciation and depreciation and how it helps, let's set up another example between Joytopia and the US. All right, so again, this let's assume this is the US, and this is a country of Joytopia. All right, now imagine that the exchange rate between Joytopia and the US is $1 equals 1 Joytopian peso. Now imagine also, for simplicity purposes, that the income level in the US is $10 and the income level in Joytopia is 10 pesos. So that's how much money people make, which right now is the same, just to keep it simple. Let's say also that if you want to buy a t-shirt in the US, it costs you $10. And if you want to buy a t-shirt in Joytopia, it costs you also 10 pesos. All right, so we're keeping it nice and simple for now. All right, now let's create a difference in exchange rate. So let's say that now $1 is equal to 2 pesos. What you see here is a depreciation of the peso. So this is a depreciation of the peso and appreciation of the dollar. In other words, this is a strong dollar and a weak peso. Alright, why? Well, because $1 now buys you 2 pesos, which means that the dollar is stronger than the peso. Alright, now let's take a look at what that does to international trade in an open border environment. Alright, so let's say you're a citizen of the US and you have your $10 in your hand and you want to buy a shirt. If you buy a shirt in the US at $10 each, you can buy one shirt. But because you have an open border, one of the things that you could do is you could cross the border. And now with your 10 peso, with the $10, you're going to be able to get 20 pesos. Because you exchange it when you go to the other side of the border. Now with 20 pesos, because each shirt is 10 pesos, you can go ahead and exchange it, their t-shirts, for 2 t-shirts. So as an individual, you're gonna more likely to buy shirts in the other country, so your imports will go up on the individual side because people are gonna want to bring the shirt. Okay, now let's take these to the extreme and let's talk about what international trade basically is. A lot of international trade takes advantages of these differences. So one of the things that you could do now, if you're a producer or somebody who just buys, what you basically do is you take these 2 shirts and then you move the shirts into the US. You can then sell each one of those shirts for $10. So now your 2 shirts turn into $20 in money. And then now you cross with the $20 to the other side, and then you turn them into 40 pesos, which then turn into 4 shirts. And then you take those 4 shirts and then you bring them to the other side again as an import, and then now you make, with the 4 shirts, $40, and you keep doing that, and welcome to international trade. Okay, so a strong dollar and weak peso makes imports go up in the US. It makes the US stronger of a purchaser outside the US than inside the US because you have a strong dollar. Okay, so let's see what happens on the other side as well, so you understand how now it changes the behavior also of Choitopia citizens. Choitopia citizen now has 10 pesos in their hand. If they cross the border to buy a shirt in the US, because of the exchange rate, they're only going to have $5 in their hand. So they're going to need 20 pesos to buy $10 to get a shirt. Why would you want to do that when you could go to your own local market and get one shirt with your 10 pesos? So now you're not going to import as much from the US, and exports to those markets are going to drop. All right, in case you did not understand what just happened here, a strong dollar in general, for the purpose of international trade, is bad for the US. Because a strong dollar makes imports increase and it makes exports drop. So it makes imports go up and it makes exports decline. All right. Hey, it's a video. Remember, you can always rewind and watch it again if that didn't make any sense. So, the process of globalization is basically the process of opening things up to trade. So, globalization is the process of becoming more open to trade. Protectionism is the process of closing borders and putting barriers. Because of COVID-19, a lot of countries have gone protectionistic. This might be a temporary thing, but it could turn into something more in the future. I guess we will see. When did this globalized world that we have today started? Well, there is no one point that you could say, but there is a major agreement after World War II that sort of accelerated the globalized world that we have today. And that agreement is Bretton Woods. The agreement happened in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and 44 allied nations got together in New Hampshire, US, in July 1944. And what they were basically doing is they started setting up international rules, institutions, and procedures to regulate the international monetary system. They reestablished the gold standard and created something called the International Monetary Fund. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Bretton Woods Agreement, okay, here's a pretty good article about some of the things that it did. Investopedia even has something about the Bretton Woods Agreement. Okay, so again, if you're interested, visit that place and read a little bit about that. Look, Wikipedia has also explanations on the Bretton Woods Agreement. All right. One of the major things that it did, by the way, is it reestablished credibility on the currencies of a lot of countries. So one of the major things that the Bretton Woods agreements did is it created a fixed exchange rate between the US dollar and 4 major world currencies at the time. That was the French franc, the Deutsche Mark from Germany, the Japanese yen, and the pound, the British pound. And it created also a fixed exchange rate between the dollar and commodity like gold and later on silver. All right. Some people call this the gold standard. This is called the gold standard. It's also, it's more of a commodity standard, really, if you talk about silver and other things that were created to support this standard. Somewhere around the year 1971, a lot of these stuff stopped working or was no longer needed. So it was basically dropped in the 70s. Another agreement that was extremely important for the globalized world that we have today was the GATT agreement, and this stands for General Agreement of Tariffs and Trades. It happened after 1947 in World War II, and it was a non-discrimination agreement between members that were participating in this particular agreement so that we could rebuild Europe. The major purpose of GATT was to rebuild Europe, and it was an agreement between the 23 member nations at the time to provide a sort of multilateral agreement between all these nations. Now, this agreement was so successful that a lot of people wanted to join it. So after GATT was ended, they turned GATT into the WTO. So the agreement was kind of rolled and rechanged into the World Trade Organization, which is what we have today as of the 2020. Last time I checked, there were about 159 member nations of the World Trade Organization. All right. Again, here is a okay. So here's a article if you want to learn a little bit more about the World Trade Organization, what they are, and then a little bit about GATT agreements. All right. Now, something a bit more complicated is the European Union. Now, the European Union is 27 countries in Europe, and it used to be 28, but the United Kingdom dropped out of the European Union in this famous Brexit that's happening. Well, it's been happening for about 3 years now, again, as of 2020. They are now officially out. Now, they have all these agreements. One of them is what we a common currency, also known as the euro. Now, inside the European Union, you have the European Union countries, which could be on the European Union, but don't have to be in the Eurozone. The Eurozone is a separate group of countries that also use the euro as their currency. So you could be in the European Union, but you do not need to be in the Eurozone. You could be a European Union country, but not in the Eurozone. Now, the biggest purpose of the European Union is to create an area where there are very low or no barriers to trade or movement of goods and services. So they're trying to create easy labor flow and easy flow of goods and people along all of their European Union members. The European Union agreement, by the way, is very complicated. They did a survey in Europe a few years ago, and they found out that most people in Europe could not explain the European Union agreement, so they created this website called Europa, which is the official website for the European Union. These, by the way, are all the languages spoken in the European Union. Click on English. No, thank you. All right, so this right here is if you want to learn a little bit more about the European Union. That was the purpose of this website, is to kind of help people understand how the European Union works and things of that sort. Okay, there are 27 members of the European Union. These are the current members of the European Union. All right, these are the members that are on the, it's called the Schengen area or border-free area. These are countries that are interested in joining the European Union and are maybe in the process of joining. These are all the countries that are in the European Union but are not currently members of the European Union. This is a map. The yellow countries are in the European Union, while the other dark countries are in Europe but not members of the European Union. Let me show you the countries that are members of the border-free area. So these are members of the border-free area in the European Union. All right, let me show you countries that use the euro. This is what it's called the eurozone. Okay, so these are countries that basically have given up their currency and they are using the euro as a unified currency. Other countries may also accept the euro and their own currency. So if you go to the United Kingdom, this is an example. They accept the euro as a currency. And if you, like, for example, if you go buy something at a machine, it will take euros and it would also take pounds. Okay? So, again, like I said, the European Union is a very complex set of agreements. So if you're interested in learning about it, go ahead and look at those websites a little more. Now, what do we have in the U.S.? Well, in the U.S., we now have an agreement called USMCA, which stands for United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement. The United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement, it's a successor of NAFTA. NAFTA stands for North American Free Trade Agreement. It was finalized somewhere around 2008, and it's now about 12 years old. So the Trump administration in the year 2017-2018 wanted to kind of rework that NAFTA agreement. So what they basically did was they took the NAFTA agreement, they make changes to it, and they turn it into now what it's called USMCA. I like to call it NAFTA 1.1 because if you really look at the two agreements, there were changes on the agreement, but it's not like you rewrote the entire agreement. It was more like imagine that you have a book and you didn't like paragraph 17, then you basically scratch that and put a new one. And that's kind of like what happened. All right. So they took the same NAFTA book and they just rewrote it a little bit and they called it USMCA. USMCA has already been ratified by Congress and it's a new agreement. All right. The NAFTA agreement has very little labor flow. So we have some labor flow agreements, but not much. In other words, if you're a Canadian citizen, you still don't have the right to work in the US. If you're a US citizen, you still don't have the right to work in Canada. Or if you're a Mexican citizen, there's a special, if you're a Canadian or Mexican, again, there's special permits you have to apply to be able to work in the other country. All right, but it creates a very good goods flow. So we don't have a lot of tariffs, we don't have a lot of quotas, and that's for goods. All right. So this was a chapter. I hope you like this chapter. I definitely enjoyed it. So this was a chapter on comparative advantages and gains from trade. Have a good one. It's another PowerPoint by Professor Choi.